Hi everyone, welcome to our panel discussion on the roadmap to net zero with reference to the energy policy framework. I'm Apurba, I'm an associate partner with the ESG practice in KPMG in India, and I lead climate within the practice. I'm joined by an eclectic set of panelists today, all of whom are experts in their own right within the energy domain. So I'm very excited and I'm hoping for a spirited and informative conversation today as I speak to all of them. So today we're joined by Mr. Sabyasachi Majumdar, who's a Senior Vice President and Group Head of Corporate Ratings for ICRA. Mr. Subrahmanyam Pulipaka, who is the CEO of the National Solar Energy Federation of India. Mr. Pinaki Bhattacharyya, who is the MD and CEO of AMP Energy India. Mr. Siddharth Singh, who is part of the Energy Investments Unit of the International Energy Agency. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you, and so glad to be speaking to you today. So let's get started, and maybe what I can do is begin with a bit of context setting before getting reactions from our speakers. We know that India today is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it's faced with the challenge of meeting its rising energy demands while at the same time pursuing a low carbon economy in conformance with climate friendly pathways. And although the energy use on a per capita basis today in India is well below global averages, the overall energy demand from the country is going to rise significantly as we inch towards the 5 trillion global economy mark and beyond that, in fact. In fact, our peak demand yesterday afternoon, which is May 17th, reached 220 gigawatts, which is historically the highest daily peak demand for the country. And this is not unexpected. But owing to this growth in demand, India's dependency on imports to meet its energy needs has also steadily been going up in the last decade. And it may even cross 50% by the time we get to 2030. So the vision to an Atmanirbhar Bharat is an uphill task unless we can readily address the challenges to accelerating that shift to cleaner and greener technologies from the supply as well as the demand side. And what we really need to enable this transition is a holistic policy framework that helps decouple energy sector emissions and economic growth while straddling this growing energy demand in economically and environmentally efficient ways. And we do have a number of progressive policies in place in India today that contribute in this direction, whether it's in renewables, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, energy storage, waste to energy, or even futuristic technologies such as hydrogen. But achieving a net zero economy for a country like India, it's not just about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It needs to be centered on its people, such that affordability, energy security, and sustainability are all key pillars in this transition. One that is capable of providing greater energy access to the energy poor as well. With this, I'd like to turn to Mr. Sabyasachi Majumdar. There's no denying that we have made substantial progress in the last decade on clean energy technologies, on the supply side especially, and especially on renewables. For example, India currently has the fourth highest wind installed capacity globally. And this is owing to a number of different fiscal and financial incentives that have effectively mobilized the much needed private sector investment. But our demands are also growing at perhaps even a faster rate, and so are our ambitions, such as the target to get to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030. Or, for example, our ambition to scale up bioenergy and its use across the economy. There's also a big push towards the development of other new clean energy technologies, like I mentioned, whether it's battery energy storage, green hydrogen, offshore wind, which are all at nascent stages. But the access to affordable finance at the scale and pace that is needed in line with our ambitions, it continues to be a barrier. And perhaps credit risk and policy risk are the two major constraints when it comes to overcoming this barrier. In your opinion, how can policy frameworks enable risk mitigation? And what are some of the major challenges you foresee in doing so? And what role potentially can credit rating agencies be expected to play here?
Thanks, Apurva. I'd like to begin by thanking the Times Group for giving us this opportunity. So, to address the question, if we see the way renewable energy has, evolved and has grown, a large, push has come from the policy side only. I mean, there was a point of time when all these renewable energy forms, whether it was solar, wind, or other forms of energy, they were substantially more expensive than the conventional power sources such as, oil and gas, coal, thermal, you name it. But consciously, a policy decision was taken across the globe, across major consuming countries, whether it was West, whether it was even developing countries like India and China. All the countries took a conscious decision to push all these clean energies through appropriate incentives. And this included various kind of measures. For instance, there could be a renewable purchase obligation, like if you have to purchase 100 units of power, X percentage has to be mandatorily through the renewable energy sources. And in the process, societies took a call that in order to meet that, we will give them a higher returns. I mean, obviously, no producer would enter into this kind of technology unless he is getting normal return. I mean, obviously, every business has a normal return expectation. And when you are entering into a new unproven technology, naturally the entrepreneur expects a slightly higher return to account for the risk premium for entering a new segment. So that was given. I mean, it was given in various forms. For instance, let's look at Europe. They were paying very high tariffs. Even if you, for example, if you look at India, there was a point of time, if you put your mind back to vibrant Gujarat, they picked up almost 1,000 megawatts of power, solar power, at let's say somewhere around 17 rupees a unit, where the going rate for buying from conventional sources were much lower at 3 rupees. So globally, these are the kind of initiatives which happened. This was replicated through in fact, even on a bigger scale by the more developed countries. As a result of it, what happened was that it encouraged investment in technology and production processes for inputs which go into wind energy and solar energy, and that brought down the cost to such a low level that they are by and large competitive with conventional sources. Of course, you can always make say that it's not really an apple to apple comparison, because let's say thermal is schedulable. I mean, thermal is steady, whereas renewables are not steady. But the fact is, even if we take into account all those factors, the fact is that even on a standalone basis, many of these technologies have now become fundamentally cost competitiveness. And that is where we need to be. I mean, we need to have a situation where these renewable energy technologies, whether it's in the form of generation of power or whether it's in the generation of energy in the form of green hydrogen or any other source, they should become on their own competitive. But for that, we'll have to push. The societies will have to take a conscious call to push technology, push all these measures, whether it's through fiscal support or through policy measures, so that they acquire volumes of scale and become competitive with conventional sources, particularly when you also account the cost for the various externalities. For instance, the counter argument could be that fine, renewable energy is still not competitive with thermal when it comes to, let's say, round the clock power. But then someone could say that, if you're burning coal or if you're burning oil and gas, there is a certain social and environmental cost. Once you take into account, you are fundamentally cost competitive. So essentially what I see is very important to have a policy push. But more importantly, not only should there be a policy push, those policies need to be very strictly implemented, and there needs to be penalties to ensure that those policies, once they are agreed upon, are not violated by the stakeholders. For example, just to take an example, in India, we were able to bring down, the renewable energy cost, but we see that in certain states, for various reasons, even power is being sold at the mid 2 rupees. The state governments find a way of, trying to get out of the PPA or not pay in time. So there needs to be a very strong, deterrent mechanism needs to be put into place to ensure that these policies are very strictly adhered to. All the contracts are very strictly, adhered to by all the stakeholders in the system. That is what I see the key measures. First is to identify policies which will push renewables in the right direction, and also to ensure that they're strictly enforced. Now coming to your second question, which was on the rating agencies. Now let me make it clear as a rating agency that we don't really facilitate businesses. The mandate of the rating agencies is very simple. We have to calculate. We have to estimate the risks and do a relative ranking. I mean, when we say someone is AAA, we say that is the lowest risk business. And this is largely from a purely financial perspective, and the perspective of being able to meet all your liabilities in a timely manner. And if you're in a lower rating, naturally, your financial risks associated with your debt servicing risk are higher with those kind of companies. So as rating agencies, it's not really our job. We are not really allowed to or mandated to promote any particular, technology. But at the same time, we do understand as a rating agency, as our, we are becoming more sensitive to the fact that, ESG compliance, whether it's environment, whether it's a social risk or governance risks, those have to be addressed. Because, for example, a certain, let's say, conventional energy, they may be more mature and they may be able to generate, power at a lower cost. But at the same time, we do understand that, there are environmental challenges which will be arising out of that, and which may make the business fundamentally unviable, or there could be very strict regulatory action against those kind of companies which may make their businesses unviable in the long run. So that over a period of time gets reflected in our ratings also. So ESG has become a very important part of the rating methodology for the various rating agencies, and that is one way we know we are pushing in that direction.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Majumdar. Absolutely. I agree that the kind of reduction that we've seen in terms of levelized cost of tariff for wind or solar, and they've come to parity much sooner than most analysts expected, when the solar mission was first launched, or when the accelerated appreciation benefits or grid-based incentives were first rolled out for the wind sector. I think we really didn't, anticipate the kind of impact it would create. But this is a renewable story, right? And I think there are many other technologies, like you also touched upon some of them, such as battery storage, hydrogen, or CCU, yes, that are still in their infancy, but have a very important role to play in the net zero transition, right? And perhaps they continue to face some of the challenges that are in fact endemic to the infrastructure space in general, because clean energy projects also need very long-term financing, like infrastructure projects. So because it's not just about adequate financial flows, but also about how low or affordable the cost of finance can be, and one that doesn't put an undue burden on the end consumer or the price of the end product. Right?
So initially, I would think that in the initial phase, when you are setting up these new projects, possibly equity as well as grants from governments would become would possibly be a much larger pie of the overall funding, and probably commercial debts would be a much lower part of the funding mix in the initial stage. Only when these technologies are proven and become fundamentally viable, then only debt financing will account for a much larger chunk of the overall funding mix for such projects. That's my sense again.
Absolutely, and I think that similar experience for us, that we've seen it moving more from equity now, but largely equity, to now moving a little bit more towards debt. And also in terms of our experience with green bonds, and we've assured more than 85% of the green bonds that have been issued from India, and that's where we're seeing this huge sort of traction on the green bonds as well as the sustainability linked bond space as well, where a lot of interest is growing. But where I was coming from in terms of the credit rating agency question is that I know I completely agree with you. You're not mandated to be enablers, but credit risk assessments and ratings have a very important role to play as a measure of credit risk for clean energy finance, and that does have in ways have a bearing on the cost of finance. And I think that is where I was sort of coming from when I asked the question. But I completely agree with you on what you said. But having said this, and when we talk about risk mitigation, there are technology challenges to be addressed too, right? When it comes to renewables, including established technologies like renewables, it's about intermittency, scalability, grid integration, and especially when we talk about solar, and Mr. Majumdar touched upon some of these aspects as well. But then there are other challenges like power system flexibility constraints, the competing use of land, poor financial health of our distribution systems. These are all common issues across renewable technologies, right? On the manufacturing side as well, India is largely import dependent when it comes to solar modules or batteries, for example. So with this, I'd like to turn to Mr. Subrahmanyam. In your opinion, what are some of the strategies that we should adopt within the energy policy framework to encourage a sort of systematic shift towards renewable energy sources at a pace that is more enhanced and eventually leading to a 100% renewable economy? And how can all of these challenges that I talked about and some that Mr. Majumdar touched upon, how can they effectively be addressed?
Thank you very much for the question. And I think the way we look at it is every challenge is an opportunity. And the problems that you outlined, these have been legacy problems to some extent. And some of them, I would say, are, when as a country now, we have graduated to first world problems when it comes to accommodating renewables in the grid. But I think the policy related framework is already changing quickly to accommodate these challenges and ensure that we witness a very sustainable proliferation. Intermittency is one of the key points that you highlighted. It is no brainer that renewable energy sources, by the virtue of being dependent on nature, are giving intermittent power as output. But we have seen over the last 3 years, starting from 2019, the way the tenders are designed and the off-takers' appetite increasing for a firm and dispatchable RE power. The first peak power tender was a huge success, which was followed by the round-the-clock tender in the beginning of COVID-1. We then witnessed significant changes in the way off-takers look at solar or wind. Now it's no longer a plain vanilla solar or plain vanilla wind. It's either solar wind hybrid, which can give you a much more time frame of power generation, or coupled with storage to address your peak power, or in a different configuration to supply power round the clock with specific CUF assigned to different time frames. So the intermittency part is something that we are trying to address, and as an advocacy body, NSEFI has been at the forefront of advocating not just systemic changes at the central level, but also from the off-taker point of view also, so that more renewables can be accommodated. Which brings us to the grid integration problem, which is now also a huge opportunity. Today, in terms of installed capacity, renewables are 35%. In terms of energy generation, they are around 12-13%. Solar is more than 50% in terms of installed renewable capacity in the country. And it's only going to grow twice in the next 7 to 8 years. This brings with it a set of unique challenges that need to be addressed so that our grid can accommodate the growing intensity as well as the spread of solar energy. There have been a lot of policy frameworks in discussion. Some of them have been rolled out. But one thing that India can seriously consider is to uniformly look at these regulations and policies. For example, you look at DSM, that we are one nation, we are under one sun, so I think we should have one DSM for the entire country. Same thing goes with other aspects of grid management and integration. We are very happy Grid India is solely responsible for operating and scheduling and dispatch, and that sort of gives a sense of uniformity. But I'm sure we can definitely look into things that can help us achieve much more flexible operation of renewables. Land was also something that you mentioned, and I would like to take some time here and focus on some of the initiatives that the government is planning and where NSEFI is part of. Today, most often than not, we are not able to see the benefits of renewable passed down to the lower strata of the community, who are ultimately the real beneficiaries of the power generated. One of the key issues has been a lot of times misconceived is the land conversion to solar and how solar is displacing a lot of land activities that existed before. We have been advocating for co-locating solar and agriculture, and today the ministry has a committee that has been formed where we are trying to advocate and come out with a policy which can promote co-locating solar with agriculture. It is tried and tested. Germany, Italy, France, US have a very robust framework, and I don't see any harm in India looking at it. After all, we are a very robust agrarian economy who are very serious about achieving our climate goals, and I don't think there can be a better combination than solarizing agriculture or co-locating solar with agriculture. But last but not the least, we strongly believe, and as India's largest umbrella body, which is at the helm of policy advocacy, that the policy framework, all said and done, has to be a continuously evolving process. What we were worried about in 2014 is something that we don't even talk about today. The same thing is going to happen for the issue that we are more concerned about in terms of the grid integration, in terms of the intermittency today. 3-4 years later, I don't think we will even talk about that. So I think while we are reacting to the scenario, while we are trying to accommodate the growing intensity of renewables, we should also keep in mind the vision and the trajectory that is in front of us, so that can help us plan it in a more wiser and efficient way. And I think all said and done, India is at the center of climate action, and India is also now the place where the entire action related to renewables is centered at. And I think this gives us an opportunity to make sure that we are going to add more capacity in the next 7 years than what we have added totally, including conventional, in the last 75 years.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of excitement ahead in terms of that. But, like you shared, we've seen how the approach in terms of policy has evolved over the years, but how also the scale of players have evolved, right? We went from smaller land holdings in wind power when it started to much larger grid scale projects once, the tariff was started, which is why you need that sort of economies of scale to be able to be competitive. And I think that is one of the reasons why the lands started becoming such a big issue, and the whole difference between what is wasteland versus what is productive land where local communities still reside. But having talked about these larger grid scale utility kind of operations, when it comes to the distributed energy segment, right, there's still like various challenges, right? So for example, the policies for net metering, the import duties on solar modules, the information asymmetry in general when it comes to individual consumers or smaller players, right? And you also talked about agriculture and co-locating renewable power. And when we talk about agriculture, again, here that this is where distributed energy generation can be a big game changer, given the quality of grid access in remote locations. And already we are seeing that for example, solar powered pumps have found very good adoption across states, given that the cost of irrigation is actually quite significant for the farmer when it comes to their total cost. So here again, there are various kind of renewable applications that are starting to find their footing. And in fact, just some while back, the Union Power Minister talked about the fact that the government plans to bring forward a scheme for promoting distributed solar and wind energy applications within the country. In fact, large programs on solar rooftop and solar irrigation, which haven't really sort of taken off in terms of, for example, the solar rooftop targets that we had. We're nowhere close to like meeting them over the sort of span of ever since the solar mission was launched. So I think there still are some areas in which I think greater policy intervention is perhaps required. Yeah, would you like to reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, all I want to say is that India is definitely a land of opportunities. Pun very unintended. But when we look at this decade is surely going to be the decade of distributed renewable energy. I agree with you. It is mired with a lot of challenges which are sort of inherent in their nature. But in terms of the distributed renewables, you can look at them from 3 different contexts. One, let us look at them from a corporate procurement and C&I and open access side. Second is the residential rooftop. Third is microgrids, agri-PV and all. So the C&I part, I definitely see huge and very steep update that is going to come up in the next 3 to 4 years. Green Open Access Rules was launched on July 7th last year. A lot of corporates who have pledged for RE100 now have something at their disposal to, address it. Of course, there are problems at state level I don't want to go into, but that is one aspect. The rooftop part, again, the streamlining has to be done. We have a Prime Minister who launched the rooftop direct benefit transfer portal last year in July on 30th. And since then, we are seeing and witnessing a huge upward trend also in the residential rooftop. And we are trying to see how we can raise awareness and bring stakeholders to commoditize solar so that it becomes more acceptable as a commodity in the mass segment. Because the adoption here should be in masses. It cannot be in the utility scale kind of things in patches. The third aspect is the microgrids and agri PV or solar pumps and all, where I think the policy framework is good and comprehensive, but on the implementation level, we have some issues that are very specific to states and stakeholders, which if are addressed, we can look at a huge increasing trend from these three aspects also. But I don't want to sound very utopian, but I'm sure that maybe 4 or 5 years down the lane, before we go to 2030, we might witness 1 or 2 years where our distributed installations might overpower or outrun the utility installations. And that is not just wishful thinking, but that is a message we are getting from both the policymakers and the businesses.
Great, noted. So you're very optimistic about distributed energy generation and the fact that this is a defining decade, and so that's good news. But since you started talking about CNI, I'd like to turn now to Mr. Bhattacharya. Having talked about agri and communities and DRE, we know that the CNI or commercial and industrial segment is also a very important one, right? At present, it's the majority contributor of consumer of electricity in India, and today they primarily meet their power demand through the grid, in some part through captive power generation, perhaps about 1/4. And only a very small portion is met through open access sources, even if you consider rooftop solar. But several companies, and I think this is a fast growing segment, however, even if at the current moment in terms of, if you look at the totality, it's a small one, but it's a growing segment. And several companies, and I think more than 100 companies in India, have already set net zero targets for themselves. And some of these targets are much closer. In fact, most of these targets are much closer than 2070, which is India's net zero time frame. But most of these targets are veering more towards a mid-century time frame. Also, several companies have set 100% RE procurement targets for themselves, even in the short to medium term. So within the 2025 to 2030 timeframe as well. So what do you see are some of the major challenges for corporate India to achieve these goals in this short and medium time frame? And in your view, what are the strategies they can deploy?
Okay. So yeah, thank you for the question. So essentially, first let me tell about where are we coming from in this debate. So we are basically a developer and we are generators of renewable energy, and we basically sell the renewable energy to the CNI customers as well as the utility customers. So we are the players the policy framework is trying to push, actually, where we actually have to invest a lot of money to enable people to get to the net zero target. Having said that, so basically we are dealing with CNI customers directly, where we are working with them through distributed generation and open access to give them renewable energy. 50% of our portfolio is also selling green energy directly to DISCOMs and to SECI also. So we are in both the segments essentially. And because we feel that both of them should go to net zero at the end of the day and not just the corporates. Now, second thing is that going by the topic of the seminar, that is the road to net zero and the energy policy framework. And you rightly said that the road to net zero has to pass through the road to RE100 first. Okay. And that is a clear-cut near-term target. So I'll just talk about the road to RE100 and within that framework where the opportunities and the issues are. So that is a very structured way of going through it. So the exciting thing is today, any corporate across the country, there is a path to go to RE100. It is there, essentially. Second, the government has also put a very firm mandate in terms of ensuring that all the obligated entities actually reach the target. And if they do not, there will be penal mechanisms. We were actually there at a meeting with the power minister, and he was very clear about it. And we are really happy that that is the case. So basically, so these are the two things. Now, the road to RE100 has 4 steps essentially. So the first step is distributed generation. That is all the CNI customers essentially within their factories, whatever space that they have, they can put distributed generation. And I believe the previous panelists already spoke about the issues there. One is obviously the net metering and certain other issues are there. And there are mainly at the state level, actually, because it's a concurrent subject, certain states create issues. And we are actively working with the central government and the regulatory bodies to solve those. By the way, I also lead an association called DISPA, Distributed Solar Power Association, where we are talking about all the policy interventions we need to do for promotion of CNI customers. So that is distributed generation is the first step. Normally in the RE100 journey, somebody will cover not more than 10% through the first step. Next step is intrastate open access. So where the factory is within the state and the generation plant is in the state, but grid connected. There essentially, in certain states it is possible, in certain other states it is not possible. As per the law, it should be possible across the country. So as the previous panelists were saying, the central government has come out with clear-cut green open access rules, which are supposed to be implemented state by state. So we are actually aggressively working state by state to ensure that they do it. And if they do not do it, we also file petitions if the need arises, because what is most important is that since this involves a lot of investment, the rules have to be followed. So, so that is the second one. So, but the positive thing is that more and more states are opening up. Earlier, it was basically Southern India. Now we have states which have opened up pan-India basis. That's a great thing. Hertz, and with this, normally corporates can go to 50 to 60% RE replacement. Now the balance 40-50% basically is through interstate open access. So in interstate open access, the policy measure that the government has given, which is the waiver of the transmission service charges, it's a very positive measure. Having said that, the issue is that there is no banking because it is on a 15-minute time block basis and there is no solution to that. And also the interstate open group captive norms are supposed to be more firmly sort of defined. So it is possible, but there are less examples of it happening as of today. Theoretically, it is possible. And also you also have to have the issue between states. Suppose you are in Rajasthan generating and let's say transporting to Karnataka. So there are state issues also involved in that. Last element is the most powerful because whatever we cannot replace through physical replacement of renewable energy is done virtually. So that is the concept called virtual PPAs, where essentially a counterparty says that, okay, I will buy the environmental attributes and the generator actually sells the power into the exchange. Actually, it's a merchant power plant. So that is an excellent way because it leads to development. The DISCOM doesn't lose a customer, and the person who is buying the credits also meets his RE100 target. So there are these 4 steps through which any entity can go to 100% RE. Now, so this is a great thing. The another thing is actually basically which is overshadowing both the CNI segment and the utility segment is the framework for fiddling around with the cost and the taxes and duties. See, in terms of the other side, in terms of the utility, it's a competitive business. Okay, there's the reverse bidding involved. You have to bid and the lowest bidder wins. So that is something investors globally really like it because it's a transparent business. There is no murky MOUs and all. Okay, and it's a very transparent system. But the issue is that is the top line. Now the bottom line is the cost. Now on the cost side, there are certain interventions the policy has done for greater good, but as a result, that is creating an issue on the cost side. One obviously is the taxation system. The taxes GST has increased in this sector, increasing the cost of renewable power, and as a result, reducing the pace at which we can install it. Second is basically the duty structure. 40% duty structure is extremely high for any country at this stage, where we do not have enough capacity still. See, we as a company are also in energy transition. We have also won a PLI bid. We are putting manufacturing also of solar cells and modules. But we know for a fact to put that together, it takes a year to 2 to put it and to stabilize it. So till the time we do not have at least 30 to 40 gigawatts of cell, wafer, and module capacity in India, we cannot take a risk of putting a duty on this thing while importing, because net result is it is actually getting passed on to the customer. They have to buy more expensive power, and at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense. Essentially, what we should do is that we should declare that when this is all operational, tier 1 quality, international quality, that time we should immediately put a very high tariff barrier so that we all buy from India and we all manufacture in India. Till that time happens, there's a mismatch between what is the demand and what is the supply available. And also the manufacturing community in India, there is no duty, there is no restriction for export. So what is happening is that most of the people who are manufacturing cells and modules, they're exporting, and you cannot import because of certain other restrictions called ALMM also. And even if you import, you have to pay a duty. It is not working. That scheme is not working essentially. So I think so they should deregulate the choice that is available Because if we are putting money to create power plants in India to get to the RE100 target and generating in India, we should have a freedom of choice. Okay, just like the buyer has a freedom of choice. So that balance has to be done. We cannot achieve everything on one day. I think so. There is a pause for 2 years, and then we should have a more sort of duty-based structure. That's the last point I wanted to make.
No, thank you. That was great. And I think thanks for highlighting all the different challenges and talking through some of the solutions. With renewables having come to parity, costs going down further, and prices continuing to fall, I think there's a very strong incentive for corporates to switch to renewables.
But they've been increasing, actually. They've been increasing. So what has happened is that we have been in the sector since inception. So they kept down and down and down. And then people started celebrating that at a very low level, which is actually unsustainable. But let's say 2.5 rupees level reached. That is for the utility large segment, not the CNI segment. But then because of this artificial mechanism of duties and taxes and all, and restriction of who you have to buy and who you cannot buy from, it started increasing essentially. So if you have seen, latest bids have actually started going up. So having said that, the silver line is that it is still better than coal, because it is still cheaper than coal and other forms of energy. So it has gone up, but still it is viable. That's where it is today.
Right, absolutely. I think in the long term also, if you look at how prices may vary, there's a strong chance that renewables will continue to remain cheaper when it comes comparison to coal. So I think and you talked about various options in terms of what companies are doing at present. It could be installing rooftop solar, procuring power through open access, or virtual PPAs. I think that was an interesting one. But also something that a lot of companies today are doing to meet their climate targets is actually purchasing renewable energy certificates as well. So that's another way that they're trying to meet their climate.
That is what is the virtual PPA actually, where actually you could get their environmental attributes,
right,
but you do not take the power. The power and environmental attributes are separated out. So
right.
that is what a virtual PPA is.
Understood.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, I think some of the bigger challenges today are at the state level, including the increasing taxation aspects you talked about, the non-availability of banking for several states. But we've seen success stories, for example, in the southern states, like you mentioned, like Karnataka, where they introduced a host of incentives, including waiver on open access charges, the reduction in terms of cross-subsidy surcharges. So I think there are a lot of success stories as well, but there are a lot of improvements to be made. But hopefully, with the new green open access regulations, it may allay some of these challenges as it finds greater adoption. But
yeah,
if we were,
we are optimistic,
but if we were to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at how this space is evolving globally, the International Energy Agency's latest study on the world energy sort of investments points out that rising costs and rising economic uncertainty, coupled with climate and energy security concerns, have been affecting global energy investments. And that any incremental capital is actually getting eroded by these rising energy costs. But at the same time, recent publications have also referenced to, India is now being at the center stage of the global energy affairs. So my next question to Siddharth of IEA is, why do you think, or why do you say that India is at the center stage today? And how has this, the country's role in the global energy landscape evolved over the years? And if you were to look forward, how will these net zero targets sort of shape India's energy future as well as its role in the global landscape?
Thank you, Apurba, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I think this has been a very fascinating conversation already, and some of our colleagues have already talked about some very sector-specific, interventions that are needed. As your question goes, I think I'd like to take a step back a little bit and talk about like maybe the overarching picture in terms of, what the trajectory of India's energy journey has been and where we are likely to be headed, and what each of these sector specific interventions, what important role they play in helping us reach to that eventual point of net zero by 2070, as was declared by the government of India. So IEA obviously tracks global energy supply, demand, use, emissions, and so on at a global level, and it has been doing for the past several decades. What we noticed was that over the past few decades, the global growth in energy demand came from China. So, and this is not surprising to anyone because China, of course, has grown economically pretty rapidly over the last several decades and reached a different level of its economic trajectory. What we notice, the change happening over the last few years is that over the next few decades, we expect India to be the largest center for global energy demand growth in the world, more than the entire continent of Africa, more than Southeast Asia, more than China, more than any other country in the world, right? So as we all know that it's often, the big changes that happen at the margins. It's always the marginal actor who has a very important role and is very consequential to the system. So for those reasons, we have talked about how India is now moving to the center stage of global energy affairs. In fact, we'd expect that whatever happens in the future, good or bad, India will have a major role to play in it. And we are already starting to see those kind of changes happen. So now the question is, if India has indeed, or India will witness this largest energy demand growth in the world over the next few decades, where is this coming from, right? So we in our analysis, we noticed that there are a few things that stick out more than others. For example, everyone usually likes to talk about population growth. In fact, India's population growth is now stabilizing. So we reached a point where the fertility rate is closer to 2, which is 2 or 2.1, which is at the replacement level. In fact, what we see is that in India's case, it is urban population particularly that will be the key driver for energy demand. So in fact, we notice, or rather we estimate that India is adding the equivalent of one Bangalore to its urban population every year over the next at least 2 or 3 decades. So we are adding a city as big as Bangalore, and you can imagine, mentally or visually, that you're adding the equivalent of Bangalore in terms of energy demand to the country every year, right? Secondly, buildings. Look around you, you'll see buildings. We estimate that this building stock is expected to triple over the next 2 or 3 decades. So tripling is a huge number. You'd expect buildings to be taller, bigger, more spread out, although 70% of these building growth happens in urban areas. Thirdly, air conditioners. Now, air conditioners, again, over 10x growth in this period. In fact, the electricity demand from cooling in India alone will be equal to Germany's total electricity demand, for the whole economy. So just cooling alone will be adding as much as Germany, which is pretty significant in terms of what it means, because cooling demand is not a consistent demand. As we all know, it peaks at certain times. It peaks at certain times of the day and certain times of the year. So it has massive implications on grid flexibility and our ability to actually deliver that electricity when people need it most. And of course, similarly, you see iron and steel and other heavy industries needing to increase its capacity by over 2x over the next 2 decades. So what all of this means is that India now has a historical opportunity to do what no country has done in the past, which is to reach a certain level of development without necessarily going down the carbon intensive path that other countries have followed. In fact, this is exactly what the net zero ambition seeks to do. In our net zero emissions study for India, which is the 2070 target, we see that India increases its per capita income levels 3 to 4 times over the next few decades. And despite this 3 to 4 times increase in per capita income levels, we eventually get to net zero emissions by 2070. In fact, a little bit before, depending on how we are able to invest. And this has several advantages beyond just emissions. So it's not just CO2. We often talk about the issues of climate justice. So other countries may have, advanced economies may have historically polluted more, and why does a country like India have to bear the brunt of it? In fact, India has advantages for itself for reasons why we should be doing this. For example, in our analysis, we see that if India invests about 2 trillion, or a little over $2 trillion US in clean energy by 2050, India can avoid fossil fuel import bills of over 2 trillion USD in this period. So, it's instead of us losing this money year after year, if we were to better utilize our own resources, we may be able to avoid that kind of fossil fuel import bill in the first place. Similarly, in the case of air pollution, we have over 1 million people in India dying prematurely year after year in India. 1 million people dying year after year is a huge number. We don't appreciate that enough. And one of the key pollutants for that is PM 2.5. As per analysis, the net zero pathway reduces this to 1/3 of its current levels by 2050 if we are able to pursue this net zero pathway. So anyway, the point is that there are several international as well as local level advantages, and I think India has made a very important decision for itself. Now the key question is how we actually go about implementing it, how we actually pursue the pathway towards that net zero. And I believe that while we have we have done quite an impressive task at scaling up renewables, even on energy efficiency, there are other aspects, particularly on end use, particularly on, if I could point out three sectors, which is freight transport, road freight transport, number two, buildings, and number three, heavy industry. I think these three sectors will be key to whether we can get to that point. And I think that we have a lot of work ahead for us in these three sectors in particular.
No, thanks, Siddharth. And I think absolutely it's massive to think of how our population is growing and how fast our sort of infrastructure needs to grow given that pace. And this is where I think energy security also gains prominence. And you talked about fossil fuel imports, which is a huge expenditure for us. Even with the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the recent past, I think it laid bare the kind of geopolitical risks that exist when it comes to energy supply as well, right? With the sort of price volatility, the supply shocks we witnessed. And we also saw that in the sort of bid to maintain energy security and understanding how important it is for any economy, several new policies and regulations, including for renewables, came up across the world, specifically in the EU as well, because that's where they face that sort of brunt of the supply shock. So I think, yeah, completely agree that I think it's very important to look at this very holistically and look at
absolutely, Apurba. And if I can just add a couple of points of context. So, this is the first time the energy crisis that has emerged in the last couple of years is the first time ever that we have a energy crisis that's truly global in its implications. In the past, we may have energy crises that are more localized. This is one that affected emerging markets as well as, of course, Europe and other countries. And it started out with natural gas, but I think other supply chains of different forms of energy have also been impacted by it. I'd also like to just say that the IEA's World Energy Investments Report, the latest one, is due to be published in the next few days. And while of course there'll be some very important messages in there, I think one of the things that I can already tell you is how much the impact of this energy crisis and this conflict in Ukraine has been on clean energy investments. In fact, initially the conversation was about, can we balance out energy security by investing more in fossil fuels and then balance it out with renewables? In fact, the opposite has been seen. Yes, of course, there has been an implication in terms of the movement of fossil fuel supply chain from earlier being dominated by Russia to other parts, but also clean energy investments have seen a major push. And I think this is something that the writing is on the wall. Regardless of what issue it is, I think clean energy is proving to be a solution that has multifaceted advantages. So the good reason for us to double down on it.
Absolutely, and I agree that the crisis affected everyone in several different sectors as well. And even in the future, I suppose this is a sort of big risk that will continue to play out, given how some of the major minerals that are required for this energy transition are actually concentrated in a handful of countries. So even as we do more explorations and discover more, the demand will continue to rise, right? So I think it's very important to sort of look at all of that pretty holistically. But thank you, and great inputs from all of the speakers. But I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to circle back to all the speakers, with the one sort of common question to all of you in terms of suggestions to enhance the current policy framework. Like we talked about today, India has a host of policy measures already in place at the central and the state levels. Subsidies for petrol and diesel were removed really quite early. There's been a huge emphasis on energy efficiency as well, something we didn't touch upon in this particular conversation, but on the demand side, you have programs like the Perform, Achieve and Trade scheme. So it's whether it's buildings, transport, and industry, there's a huge emphasis on energy efficient technology as well. And the enabling policy framework for hard to abate sectors is also underway with the push through policy measures, through demand aggregation, with emerging technologies such as battery storage or through hydrogen, or even for that matter the recent sort of big push on waste to energy, which we see today. So given all of this that's going on, what is your opinion on the one big remaining challenge, and what that one associated key policy intervention area should be that we should prioritize or focus on, which may have a significant impact. And I know we talked about some of the challenges already as we spoke, but there are several others, and maybe you'd like to highlight one of them. For example, it could be about attracting investments, ensuring cost effectiveness for both governments and consumers. It could be about socioeconomic implications of the transition. Somebody's touched upon that as well. How to make it a just transition. Or for example, when we talked about microgrids and off-grid systems, given that the government plans to have its own program, a bigger program around that, what could be some of the sort of major interventions? Or it could even be in terms of, we talked about this whole sort of geopolitical landscape. It could even be around international collaboration. So just wanted to get your thoughts on sort of one key interventions that you feel that the government should prioritize. And I'll go speaker by speaker without interrupting. So please do feel free to share any summarizing thoughts you might have in mind as well. But I'm mindful of time, so I'm hoping we would keep it brief. So maybe starting with Mr. Majumdar, and then Mr. Subrahmanyam, and then Mr. Bhattacharyya, and then Mr. Singh.
So, Apurba, the one common theme has to be that contractual sanctity has to be honored. That is the biggest challenge, I think, disputes. See, because whenever you promote these kind of technologies, get into renewable energies, or let's say green hydrogen or anything, it will be, they may or may not require subsidy. They may require certain amount of offtake commitment from various stakeholders, pricing mechanism, fiscal incentives. What is most important, and invariably their disputes and differences of opinion are going to creep upon this. And we know that in India, sorting out those disputes takes a lot of the time, and very often, even when you get a compensation, it does not adequately compensate you for the working capital cost that you have incurred in that period. So I think the key thing I must say is that our contractual systems and the dispute resolution mechanisms must be very robust for any kind of. These are all very long gestation kind of projects, and having a robust dispute mechanism will be a very important aspect of it. And of course, distribution health. I mean, the health of our distribution system, because of course, there is a part of that energy which is going to go to the corporate sector. They will only offtake as much as their requirement is and as the paying capacity is. But if we are looking at targeting large amount of power to be supplied to DISCOMs, their health has to be brought back.
Thank you, Mr. Majumdar. Mr. Subrahmanyam, would you like to go next?
Well, it would be a gross injustice on my part if I only talk about one key demand or a policy advocacy part we are talking about. I have a list of 142, but maybe I can answer it from a holistic view on what is the absolute requirement today for the policy framework in our country. And it's just 3 C's. The first C is the clarity. I think whenever we look at a policy coming out or a regulation coming out, most often than not, it is left to interpretation than on clearly laying out the boundaries. So clarity is something that we definitely want to and are looking forward to. Second is, of course, very important is the certainty. It is not good to have a policy which is not certain and you never know when it will change or it will get amended or it will get removed. So I think the certainty is also a very key factor. It does not matter whether you're talking about utility scale related policy or C&I or distributed. That is something that matters. The third one, and I'm using only this because I strongly believe, like I said, we have graduated to the first world problems. We are the 5th largest country in terms of solar capacity, 4th in terms of wind, and 4th in terms of overall RE, and only one of the 4 countries where RE capacity crossed 150. So I think it is not too ambitious to ask for a comprehensiveness when we talk about a policy or framework, that in the first go itself, if you can give as much as context and as much as bandwidth possible for every possible aspect of it, I think I don't see why things won't fall in place automatically. So yeah, so clarity, certainty, and comprehensiveness is what are my top 3 asks when it comes to any policy framework for India.
Great, thank you. Mr. Bhattacharya, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I will just talk about one point, which is basically it's 2 points. You can treat it as 1A and 1B. So the first thing is that the spirit of the Electricity Act has to be followed, and which deregulated the sector. and permitting freedom of choice. The issue remains this: it's a concurrent subject. Center and state, it's a concurrent subject. So that has to be followed to the T. So we have to figure out a mechanism that we cannot be spending so much of time doing advocacy at every state to get them to follow the overall rules of the game. And that is the biggest policy intervention that should be taken. And because there are people who have a conflict of interest who are manning some of these commissions in the states who do not want to see competition, they should be done away with essentially. It has to be firmly, strictly adhered to. That's the single, because 50% is bought by the industries. That will just open up the entire sector and everybody can run to RE100. Okay, because of that, following the spirit of the law as it is written. Second thing is that completely remove the artificial taxes, duties, and these barriers. Like we are here trying to solve an energy problem because we are growing at 6 to 8%. There is a huge demand for energy. We are transitioning to renewables. There is a target of 175 gigawatts, which we have already missed actually because of the issue at the COVID and all. We have an opportunity now to reach the target of 175, and we cannot have manufacturing and everything happening together. Essentially, it takes time. So immediately it will bring down the power cost by around 70 to 80 paise. If you do away with this kind of tariff barriers, taxes and duty barriers, who to buy, who not to buy, but focus on generation of renewable energy in India, where we basically stop our dependence on imports essentially for actually energy. That will actually like create a huge difference. We can almost do 30 gigawatts a year this year and next year. But if you're trying to do too many things, then things will happen, but it reduces the pace. That's the second issue. That this is a complete free market economy, both for buying of power and buying of equipment for power completely, and reducing the taxes and duties. So that's what I can say.
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya. Mr. Singh, would you like to go next?
Yes, of course. Just to say that again, it's hard to pick winners, and there's so many things that that could be done. But since you asked in the spirit of responding to that, I'll pick one sector that I think needs interventions and two specific things within it that we could do. So I feel that, as we kind of already discussed, I feel that the building sector is one that does not get adequate attention, and this is one that really locks in a certain way of doing things. So, for example, usually an infrastructure, say a coal-fired power plant or whatever, they have a certain time, a certain lifetime. So it could be 20 years, 30 years. In the case of buildings, it could be as high as 100 years. So if you make inefficient buildings today, you're locking in emissions for the next, several decades or a century to come. And we need to work on it today before it gets too late. Now, there are several issues obviously related to buildings, including the need for thermal comfort, because these days, the way we construct buildings is make something with the cement and steel and then slap an air conditioner and then you're done, right? That's not how it used to be done. I think we need to think about ways to ensuring thermal comfort is a part of the building design itself, and we are able to use more sustainable materials, as we go along. There are two specific interventions here that I think India, but also other countries need to work on. The first is capacity building at the auditor level and at the municipal level, because the people who are eventually in charge of ensuring building laws are followed either don't have the capacity, or there may not be enough people to do so. So I think we need to focus on that a little bit more. So we always think of national level policies. I think this is something that really requires very local level interventions. And the other is financial models for building energy efficiency and the incorporation of clean energy in this in the form of energy services companies and so on. I don't think we have adequate financial incentives for people to actually to invest in clean energy in buildings. So I think these are the two things that we can work on. And the role for international cooperation on this particular issue is actually massive. There have already been several programs ongoing to work on capacity building and financing, but I think it's not going far enough. So that's one thing that I think we should definitely work on.
Great. No, thank you. And this is great. Sorry, I made it so hard for all of you to pick any one challenge, but thank you all. These are all very critical insights as we plan for an energy transition at a pace and scale that aligns with what science demands to counteract climate change and get to net zero. To summarize, I heard about contractual sanctity, dispute resolution mechanisms, the 3 C's in terms of clarity, certainty, confidence on policy, and comprehensiveness. I also heard that the spirit of Electricity Act needs to be followed as it is written, and that we should be offering greater freedom of choice, and also ensuring some amount of uniformity within states as necessary, and also sort of work towards removing some of the tariff, taxation, and duty barriers. And like Siddharth mentioned, trying to avoid lock-in to brown technologies, encouraging capacity building, new business models in sectors such as buildings, as well as international cooperation, which is an important one. But I won't attempt to even summarize the entire discussion today, given the breadth of everything we covered, from risks to national regulations to international landscape. But this is exactly what is needed, right? The transition to a net zero economy essentially means a massive overhaul in the way that we do everything within the economy, right? How we manufacture, how we live, how we eat, how we produce, how we consume energy, how we store it, all of this and more. And India has an ambition to get to the state of net zero by 2070. This means multiple sectors, multiple ministries and departments, state and central government entities. Like you mentioned, India is a sort of federal structure. A lot of the challenges are at the state level, but also public and private sector entities all need to sort of come together and collaborate for this to be possible. And how we achieve this massive sort of coordination effort, given our developmental imperatives, the interdependencies within the economy, and how we can sort of build an energy policy framework that encourages this sort of cross-sectoral collaboration is also a very important question. But with this, and I'm conscious of time, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of our speakers and to Economic Times for organizing this very important webinar at a very critical juncture of the transition that we are in. And I wish you all the best for your flagship event, the Economic Times Energy Leadership Summit and Awards for 2023. And of course, thank you to all of the viewers.